The 5-year-old girl with patches on her face was trying to eat scraps from the trash when the manager dragged her out of a fancy restaurant and threw her into the rain. A millionaire saw everything and did something even worse. Comment what you think will happen and subscribe to the channel. The rain poured mercilessly over the city that winter night, turning the streets into raging rivers. Inside the elegant Amethyst Bistro, businessman Richard Sterling absently watched. The raindrops run down the window while savoring his solitary dinner. At 60, owner of a successful chain of boutique hotels, he was accustomed to the solitude that his fortune and social position afforded him. The restaurant's sophisticated ambiance contrasted sharply with the small figure that appeared in the entrance. A girl, no more than 5 years old, soaked to the bone, trembled violently as her eyes scanned the room. Her delicate face was marked by light patches of vitiligo, creating a unique pattern that drew attention. Her clothes, though simple and wet, still showed traces of care, as if until recently someone had looked after her appearance. The little girl moved silently between the tables like a frightened kitten, until her hungry eyes focused on a plate of leftovers on a newly vacated table. Without hesitation, she ran towards the food, her small hands grabbing a piece of bread as if her life depended on it. That's when Frank, the restaurant manager, a 38-year-old man with a perpetually stern expression, spotted the intruder. His face twisted into a mask of indignation as he strode across the room. "What do you think you're doing here?" he barked, grabbing the girl's arm with disproportionate force. "This is no place for beggars." The little girl didn't scream, didn't cry. Her eyes, large and frightened, maintained a silent dignity that contrasted with the man's violence. The piece of bread fell from her trembling hands as Frank dragged her towards the door. Richard watched the scene with growing unease. Something in that child's silent determination deeply disturbed him, awakening long-dormant feelings. Before he could fully process his actions, he was already on his feet. "Let go of the girl," his deep, authoritative voice cut through the air, causing Frank to freeze instantly. "Now." The manager hesitated, clearly torn between his instinct to expel the intruder and the automatic respect that Richard's imposing presence commanded. The girl remained motionless, her eyes now fixed on the businessman. "Mr. Sterling," Frank began, trying to maintain his composure, This child was stealing food. We can't allow that kind of behavior in an establishment like this." Richard approached slowly, his measured steps echoing in the silence that had fallen over the restaurant. The other patrons watched the scene with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. "What's the most expensive dinner on the menu?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the girl. $650, sir," Frank replied, confused by the seemingly out-of-context question. "Great," Richard took his wallet from his inside coat pocket. "Serve two, one for me and one for my guest." The manager released the girl's arm as if he had been electrocuted, his face turning red. The little girl remained standing, her eyes darting between Richard and the door as if assessing her chances of escape. "What's your name?" Richard asked, bending down slightly to get closer to her height. The girl hesitated, her lips trembling not just from the cold. "Lyra," she finally replied, her voice so low that it could barely be heard over the sound of the rain continuing to fall outside. "Well, Lyra," Richard gestured to his table with a gentle movement, "would you like to join me for dinner?" She nodded slightly, still wary, but hunger was stronger than fear. As he led her to the table, Richard noticed that her steps left small puddles on the restaurant's marble floor. "Frank," he called without turning around, "also provide a towel and, if possible, some dry clothes for the girl." The manager nodded quickly and hurried away, eager to redeem himself for his earlier behavior. Richard helped Lyra sit down, noticing how small and fragile she looked in the luxurious chair. The girl kept her eyes downcast, her hands clasped. together in her lap. Her whole body was still trembling, whether from cold or nervousness, probably both. There was something in her posture, a kind of resignation mixed with determination that didn't match her age. "How long has it been since you last ate, Lyra?" Richard asked gently. She looked up briefly, as if assessing whether she could trust him. 3 days, she replied after a moment of hesitation. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. 3 days was too long for anyone to go without food, let alone such a small child. Before he could ask more questions, Frank returned with a soft towel and what appeared to be a clean restaurant uniform. "It's the best we could do at the moment, sir," the manager explained, now overly solicitous. Lyra accepted the towel with a timid nod, drying herself as best she could without getting out of the chair. Her small hands gripped the fabric as if it were a precious treasure. The first course arrived, a hot soup that gave off a delicious aroma. Lyra's eyes widened slightly, but she made no move to pick up the spoon. "You can eat," Richard encouraged, noticing her hesitation. "It's okay." As if those words had broken some invisible spell, Lyra began to eat. Although her desperate hunger was evident, she maintained controlled, almost dignified movements, as if someone had taught her good manners. As he watched her, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about this child, something that went beyond her unique appearance or her mature behavior for her age. It was as if fate had orchestrated this meeting for some reason he didn't yet understand. "Where are your parents, Lyra?" Richard asked when she had already finished half of the soup. The girl stopped eating, her hand gripping the spoon tightly enough to make her knuckles turn white. When she looked up, her eyes were watery, although no tears fell. "My dad..." Her voice failed and she swallowed hard before continuing. "My dad is sleeping in the hospital. He hasn't woken up in a long time." Richard felt the air escape his lungs. The way she said that, with a mixture of childlike hope and adult understanding of the gravity of the situation, was devastating. "And your mother?" Lyra shook her head negatively. "I never met her. It's always just been me and Dad." The rain continued to fall outside, but now it seemed different. It was no longer just a natural phenomenon, but a prelude to something bigger, a change that Richard couldn't yet fully grasp. "How did your dad end up in the hospital?" he asked, although something inside him told him he might not want to know the answer. Lyra lowered her spoon, her eyes losing focus, as if reliving a painful memory. "It was the fire," she finally replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Our apartment caught fire. Dad got me out of there, but then he didn't wake up anymore." Richard felt the weight of those words like a physical blow. The fire. Suddenly, the girl's wet clothes and exhausted appearance took on a much deeper and more painful meaning. "Where have you been sleeping?" he asked, dreading the answer. Lyra fidgeted with the edge of the napkin, avoiding his gaze. "In the hospital." "Garden," she replied softly, "but the guards always send me away. I try to go back when they're not looking." A 5-year-old child sleeping outdoors, desperately trying to stay close to her comatose father. The image was too disturbing for Richard to ignore. "Which hospital is he in?" "County General," Lyra replied, her fingers now playing with the empty spoon. "Room 304. I always go there in the morning when the nurses are changing shifts. Sometimes they let me stay for a little while when the supervisor isn't around." There was a sad wisdom in her words, the kind of knowledge that no child should have. Richard found himself making a decision that would change his life forever, although he didn't know it yet. "Finish your dinner," he said softly. "Then we'll go there." Lyra's eyes lit up for the first time since entering the restaurant. "We can go see Daddy." Richard nodded, watching as she went back to eating with renewed enthusiasm. Meanwhile, his mind worked quickly. He needed to better understand the situation, find out if there were any relatives, anyone who could take care of her. When they finished the meal, Lyra had already changed her wet clothes for the clean restaurant uniform, which, even being the smallest available, was still too big on her. Richard asked his driver to meet them at the entrance. The rain had subsided to a fine drizzle when they got into the luxurious car. Lyra sat quietly, her small hands holding a worn folder that Richard hadn't noticed before. "What's in there?" he asked, trying to keep the conversation casual. "They're my dad's drawings," she replied, clutching the folder to her chest. "I managed to save them when the fire started. Dad always said they were important." Something in the way she spoke about the drawings piqued Richard's curiosity. "Can I see?" Lyra hesitated for a moment, but then opened the folder with reverent care. The drawings that emerged made Richard catch his breath. They were impressive works, with a unique style and unmistakable strokes that he knew very well. "It can't be," he murmured, taking one of the drawings with trembling hands. It was impossible not to recognize that style, the same characteristic strokes, the same way of capturing light and shadow. It was identical to the works his sister Catherine created, the same ones that decorated his house until the day he cut ties with her. "What's your father's name?" he asked, his voice hoarser than usual. "Lawrence," Lyra replied, watching his reaction to the drawing carefully. "Lawrence Mendez. He's an art teacher." The name struck Richard like lightning. Lawrence Mendez. Catherine's favorite student, the one she always said had a special gift. The young man his sister had mentioned in her last letter, the one Richard never answered. Memories he had buried years ago began to emerge. Catherine, his younger sister, had always been the artist of the family. While he built his hotel empire, she dedicated her life to art and teaching in underserved communities. Her last project had been a free art school, where Lawrence had been one of her first students. The last argument between the siblings had been about that. Catherine wanted Richard to help fund the school, but he refused, saying she was wasting her time and talent. The harsh words exchanged that day were the last between them. 3 months later, Catherine fell seriously ill. She died without them reconciling. The car stopped in front of the hospital, bringing Richard back to the present. Lyra was already unfastening her seatbelt, eager to see her father. County General Hospital was an old and poorly maintained building, a stark contrast to the luxurious establishments Richard usually frequented. The smell of cheap disinfectant and the buzzing of fluorescent lights created an oppressive atmosphere. Lyra, however, seemed to know every corridor like the back of her hand. She confidently led Richard to room 304, stopping only to wave to some nurses who clearly recognized her. The room was small and shared with another patient. Lawrence was in the bed closest to the window, his motionless body connected to various machines that beeped at a constant rhythm. Bandages covered much of his face and arms, silent witnesses to his heroic attempt to save his daughter. Lyra approached the bed with soft steps, as if fearing to wake her father. Gently, she took his bandaged hand between her small ones. "Hi, Daddy," she whispered. "I brought a friend today." Richard remained standing in the doorway, feeling like an intruder in that intimate moment. He watched as Lyra told her father about the dinner at the restaurant, about how she had managed to get dry with the new clothes, about how the drawings were safe. That's when a nurse entered the room, her expression changing from surprise to concern upon seeing Lyra. "Honey, you know you can't be here," she said, although her tone was gentle. "The supervisor has warned you several times." "She's with me," Richard spoke up, his voice automatically assuming the authoritative tone he used in negotiations. "I'm a friend of the family." The nurse seemed relieved. "Thank goodness," she sighed. "We were all worried. She shows up every day, you know. No one had the courage to ask where she was sleeping, but—" "What's his condition?" Richard interrupted, indicating Lawrence with a gesture. The nurse's expression became serious, stable but critical. The burns were very severe and there was smoke inhalation damage. He's in a medically induced coma with no prediction of when, if. She stopped, glancing at Lyra. Richard understood what she didn't say. There was no guarantee that Lawrence would wake up, and even if he did, his recovery would be long and difficult. Are there no other relatives? The nurse shook her head. None that we've been able to locate. Social services has been here a few times, but as you can see, she gestured vaguely towards the room, the system is complicated. Richard watched Lyra, who was now showing the drawings to her father, explaining in a low voice how she had managed to save them. Something inside him stirred, a mixture of old guilt and newfound determination. I'm going to fix this, he said to the nurse. Can you give me the social worker's contact information? As the nurse wrote down the number, Richard couldn't take his eyes off Lyra. The girl had a piece of paper and was drawing something, her tongue peeking out from the corner of her mouth in concentration. The gesture was so similar to Catherine's that it almost hurt. I'll be right back, he said, leaving the room to make a few calls. In the next 2 hours, Richard moved mountains. His name and influence opened doors that would normally remain closed. When he returned to the room, he had a temporary custody authorization in hand. Lyra had fallen asleep in the chair next to her father's bed, the paper with her drawing still in her hands. Richard approached silently and looked at the drawing. It was a simple but surprisingly well-done portrait of 3 people, her, Lawrence, and inexplicably himself. It was at that moment that Richard realized there was no going back. That little girl, with her vitiligo patches and her silent determination, had awakened something he thought was long dead. Lyra, he called softly, touching her shoulder. Wake up, little one. She opened her eyes slowly, disoriented for a moment. I need to ask you an important question, Richard said, kneeling to be at her level. While your father recovers, would you like to stay at my house? Lyra's eyes widened. Can I come see Daddy every day? Every day, he confirmed, and I promise I'll make sure he gets the best possible treatment. Lyra looked at her father, then at Richard, then at her drawing. Finally, she nodded slowly. What neither of them knew at that moment was that that decision would trigger a series of events that would change their lives forever, bringing to light long-buried secrets and forcing long-delayed confrontations. The Sterling mansion stood atop a secluded hill, surrounded by a meticulously manicured garden. As the car passed through the iron gates, Lyra pressed her face against the glass, her wide eyes reflecting the lights that illuminated the entrance to the property. The house was imposing with its stone walls and tall windows, but there was something cold about its grandeur, as if it lacked the warmth that transforms a building into a home. Richard couldn't help but notice how the place seemed even more austere now, seen through the eyes of a child. Gertrude, the 67-year-old housekeeper, waited at the door. Her normally stern face showed surprise at seeing the small figure accompanying Richard. In all the years she had worked there, since the traumatic divorce that had left her boss even more withdrawn, she had never seen a child cross that threshold. Gertrude, this is Lyra, Richard introduced, his voice trying to sound softer than usual. She'll be staying with us for a while. The housekeeper observed the girl carefully. Lyra was holding her drawing folder tightly, as if it were a shield, her eyes quickly scanning the environment for escape routes, a habit she had developed on the streets and that would take time to abandon. The young lady must be hungry, Gertrude said, her normally gruff tone softening involuntarily. There was something in Lyra's small and determined figure that awakened a protective instinct even in the most hardened hearts. We had dinner at the restaurant, Richard informed her, but a warm bath would be welcome, and we need clothes. I've already taken care of it, Gertrude interrupted, surprising both of them. After you called, I asked the driver to buy some basic items. We couldn't leave the girl in a restaurant uniform. Richard nodded, grateful for the housekeeper's efficiency. It was in moments like this that he realized how much he depended on her to keep his life running. "I'll show you to your room," he said to Lyra, who remained standing in the same place as if fearing to move. The chosen room was on the second floor, overlooking the back garden. It was one of the many guest rooms that were never used, its elegant but impersonal decor reflecting the lack of real life in that house. "We can make the room more suitable tomorrow," Richard commented, realizing how the austere environment could seem scary to a child. "Buy some things you like." Lyra walked to the window, observing the now dark garden outside. The rain had stopped, but the leaves of the trees still glistened with water droplets under the garden lights. "Can I draw here?" she asked in a low voice, her fingers unconsciously caressing the folder she was still carrying. "Of course," Richard replied quickly, relieved that she was showing interest in something. "We can get drawing supplies too, if you want." Her eyes lit up for a moment, but soon returned to displaying concern. "But won't you spend too much money on me?" The question hit Richard like a punch. A 5-year-old child shouldn't worry about expenses, shouldn't carry that kind of weight. "Don't worry about that," he said, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. "I'll leave you with Gertrude to take a bath and get ready for bed. I'll be in the study if you need anything." He left the room feeling strangely disturbed. In his study, he poured himself a shot of whiskey and sat in his favorite armchair, trying to process the events of the last few hours. Catherine's face came to his mind, smiling in that characteristic way she had when she knew something he hadn't yet realized. His sister always said that he needed to learn to see beyond appearances, beyond the monetary value of things. He never listened. A sharp scream cut through his thoughts. He jumped up, knocking over the glass, and ran towards the sound. It was coming from Lyra's room. He found Gertrude trying to calm the girl, who was thrashing in bed, still clearly trapped in a nightmare. Her eyes were open, but they didn't seem to see anything but the terror that consumed her. "Fire!" she screamed, her small hands gripping the sheets. "Daddy, the fire is coming!" Richard froze for a moment, not knowing how to act. Gertrude tried to hold Lyra, preventing her from hurting herself in her frantic movements. "Wake up, honey," the housekeeper called with a gentleness that Richard had never heard in her voice. "It was just a dream. You're safe here." Gradually, Lyra seemed to emerge from the nightmare. Her eyes focused on the environment around her, recognition gradually replacing terror. When she realized where she was, she began to cry silently. "Sorry," she sobbed, shrinking as if expecting a punishment. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You don't have to apologize," Richard approached the bed hesitantly. "Nightmares happen." Gertrude straightened the sheets that had become tangled during the episode. "I'll make some chamomile tea," she said, giving Richard a meaningful look before leaving. Left alone with Lyra, Richard felt completely lost. He didn't know how to comfort a frightened child. His own son, Theodore, had suffered from nightmares when he was little, but it was always his mother, Bethany, who took care of those situations. "Do you want to talk about the dream?" he asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. Lyra hugged her knees, making herself even smaller. "It was the fire again," she murmured. "I always dream about it. I see Daddy carrying me, but this time he can't get out." Silent tears streamed down her face, creating shiny paths over the vitiligo patches. Richard felt something break inside him. "Your father was very brave," he said softly, "and he's going to be okay. I promise we'll take care of him." Lyra looked up, studying his face as if looking for signs of a lie. "You really promise?" "I promise." Gertrude returned with the tea, served in an antique porcelain cup that Richard recognized as part of his late sister's favorite set. The housekeeper must have saved some pieces over the years. As Lyra sipped the tea, Richard noticed the folder of drawings on the bedside table. One of the papers had slipped out and caught his attention. "May I?" he asked, pointing to the drawing. Lyra nodded, still holding the cup with both hands. Richard picked up the paper carefully. It was a portrait of Lawrence, drawn with childlike strokes but surprisingly expressive. The father was smiling, sitting in front of an easel. In the background, one could see a bookshelf filled with books and paintings. "That was our apartment," Lyra explained, noticing his interest. "Before the fire. Daddy always drew after he came back from the school where he taught. He's a great artist," Richard commented, thinking about the other drawings he had seen, those that carried Catherine's unmistakable style. "Yes," Lyra agreed, a small smile appearing on her face for the first time since the nightmare. "He teaches." "Me too. He says it's important to preserve art, that it tells stories that need to be remembered." The words were clearly a quote, probably something Lawrence said frequently. They were also, Richard realized with a pang, something Catherine used to say. After Lyra finished her tea and fell back to sleep, this time more peacefully, Richard returned to his study. He couldn't go back to sleep. He spent the night reviewing old documents, looking for the last letter Catherine had sent him. He found it at the bottom of a drawer, the paper yellowed with time, still retaining the characteristic perfume that his sister used. In the letter, Catherine talked about her students, especially about a young man named Lawrence, who she said had a special gift. "He reminds me of you, bro," she had written. "He has the same intensity, the same dedication. Only he can see beauty where others only see numbers." Richard never answered that letter. 3 months later, Catherine was dead, taken by a disease that developed too quickly for any intervention. Now 2 decades later, fate had placed the daughter of his sister's favorite student in his path. It was the kind of coincidence that Catherine would adore, the kind of story she would say had been painted by the universe. A noise in the hallway made him look up. Through the half-open door of the study, he saw Lyra walking silently, still clearly asleep. Sleepwalking, he realized with a start. He got up quickly and went to her, gently guiding her back to the room before she hurt herself. She didn't wake up, muttering only incomprehensible words about fire and drawings. After settling her back, in bed, Richard remained in the room, watching her restless sleep. How would he take care of a traumatized child? He, who had barely known how to take care of his own son. The answer came in Catherine's voice, as clear in his memory as if she were there. "Sometimes, bro, all we need is to open our hearts and let art teach us a new path." The days that followed established a peculiar routine in the Sterling mansion. Every morning, Richard took Lyra to visit Lawrence at the hospital before going to the office. The girl spent a few minutes with her father, telling him about her previous day, showing him new drawings, always hoping for some sign that he was listening to her through the coma. The nurses had already gotten used to the presence of the little artist, as they affectionately called her. Some even kept blank sheets of paper in their drawers, anticipating the moments when Lyra would sit quietly in a corner of the nursing station, drawing while waiting for visiting hours. On that particular morning, something was different. Richard realized it as soon as they entered Lawrence's room. The attending physician was waiting for them, his face bearing that carefully neutral expression that health professionals develop over the years. "Mr. Sterling, can we talk in private?" Richard looked at Lyra, who was already in her usual place, next to her father's bed, taking her drawing materials out of the new backpack they had bought. "Stay here, little one, I'll be right back." In the hallway, the doctor wasted no time with small talk. "Mr. Mendes' condition is not improving as we hoped. The burns are healing, but the brain activity..." Richard felt his stomach sink. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means we need to consider the possibility of permanent damage. Even if he wakes up, there may be significant after effects. The word if hung in the air like a sentence. Richard looked through the window of the room, where he could see Lyra showing something to her unconscious father, her lips moving in a silent conversation. What are the alternatives? There is an experimental treatment, the doctor hesitated, but it's extremely costly and without guarantees of success. Cost is not a problem, Richard responded automatically. I want all the details of this treatment on my desk today. He returned to the room, feeling the weight of the responsibility. He had assumed. Lyra looked up when he entered, and for a moment Richard saw Catherine in that look, the same intensity, the same ability to see through the masks that people wore. The doctor said that Daddy will take a long time to wake up, right? The question caught him off guard. How to explain the situation to a 5-year-old child without destroying her hopes. Your father is fighting hard, he responded carefully, and we're going to help him in that fight. Lyra nodded, turning her attention back to the drawing she was doing. It was a scene of the mansion's garden, with vivid colors and strokes surprisingly steady for her age. Daddy always says it doesn't matter how long it takes, the important thing is not to give up, she said, adding small flowers to the drawing. Like when he taught me how to draw trees. I couldn't get it right, but he said all I had to do was practice every day. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. How could someone so small carry so much wisdom? The rest of the morning passed. Quickly and soon, it was time to leave Lyra with Gertrude to go to the office. The housekeeper had developed a special affection for the girl, although she tried not to show it too openly. Today, we're making cookies, Gertrude announced as Richard prepared to leave. It was the first time in years that he had seen her plan, something beyond her routine tasks. That's when the phone rang. Gertrude answered, and her expression changed instantly. Mr. Sterling, she called, her voice tense. It's your son. The world seemed to freeze for a moment. Theodore hadn't spoken to him in years, not since that last argument that had practically destroyed any possibility of reconciliation. With slightly trembling hands, Richard picked up the phone. Son? So it's true. Theodore's voice sounded cold, distant. You really took in a kid. How did you... People talk, Dad, especially when one of the richest men in town suddenly starts making daily visits to the county hospital with a little girl. Richard closed his eyes, feeling a familiar pain settle in his chest. Theodore had a gift for making every word sound like an accusation. It's not what you're thinking, he began, but was interrupted by a bitter laugh. No? Then explain it to me, Dad. Explain how you, who barely had time for his own son, has now decided to play the dedicated father to a complete stranger. She needed help, Theodore. I couldn't leave her on the street. Of course you couldn't. Always the great savior, aren't you? Always doing the right thing for others. The bitterness in his son's voice was like acid, corroding years of unresolved regrets. Why are you calling? Richard asked finally, tired of that familiar dance. Of resentment, to let you know I'm coming back to town, Mom thinks. We need to intervene in this situation. Richard felt his blood run cold. Bethany, his ex-wife, always had a knack for turning complicated situations into true nightmares. There's no situation to intervene in, he said, with more firmness than he felt. I have temporary custody of the girl, everything perfectly legal. For now, Theodore replied, and Richard could practically see the cold smile on his face. See you soon, Dad. The line went dead, leaving Richard with a sense of impending doom. He knew Bethany too well not to worry about her interventions. Sir? Gertrude's voice brought him back to the present. Is everything all right? Before he could answer, a noise coming from the kitchen caught his attention. They found Lyra standing in the middle of a mess of flour and fallen utensils. her wide eyes fixed on something that only she could see. "Fire," she mumbled, her small body trembling. "It's too hot." She was having another episode, Richard realized. Sometimes, especially when something scared her, Lyra seemed to relive the trauma of the fire, even when awake. "There's no fire, little one," he said softly, approaching carefully. "You're safe here." But Lyra didn't seem to hear him. Her hands were trying to ward off an invisible danger, her breathing becoming increasingly rapid. "Daddy!" she suddenly cried out, the sound so full of pain that Richard felt his heart break. "Don't let the fire get Daddy." Gertrude was already by her side, her years of experience helping to maintain calm. "Cold water," she murmured to Richard. "On her hands. It helps bring her back." Carefully, they guided Lyra to the sink. The touch of the water seemed to help, gradually bringing focus back to her eyes. When she finally came to her senses, Lyra looked around, confused by the mess she had caused, her cheeks flushed with shame. "Sorry," she mumbled, tears beginning to form. "I dirtied everything." "Don't worry about it," Gertrude replied with surprising gentleness. "We'll clean it up together and then make those cookies. How about that?" Richard watched the two begin to clean the kitchen, Gertrude turning the task into a kind of game to distract Lyra. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Another urgent message from the office, problems that needed his immediate attention. But for the first time in his life, numbers and deals seemed insignificant compared to what was happening in his own house. "I'm going to work from the study here today," he announced, surprising himself and Gertrude. Lyra looked up, a small smile appearing on her face still stained with tears and flour. "Can you draw with me later?" "Of course," he replied, feeling something warm grow in his chest. "But I warn you, I'm terrible at it." "It doesn't matter," she said with that peculiar seriousness she sometimes displayed. "Daddy always says that the important thing isn't to be perfect, it's to try with your heart." Once again, Catherine's words echoed in his mind. "Art isn't in perfection, bro. It's in the truth we put into it." As he watched Lyra and Gertrude resume their task of making cookies, Richard thought about Theodore and Bethany, about their veiled threats and old resentments. A storm was brewing, he could feel it, but this time, he promised himself, he wouldn't run from the conflict. This time, he would fight with all his heart. Theodore's arrival at the mansion happened on a Sunday afternoon when the garden was especially beautiful under the golden autumn light. Lyra had spent the morning drawing the flowers that Gertrude cultivated so carefully, creating small, colorful portraits that now decorated the kitchen refrigerator. Richard was in his study, reviewing the documents for Lawrence's experimental treatment when he heard the sound of tires on the driveway. His heart accelerated instantly. He knew well the roar of the engine of the sports car that his son drove. "Sir," Gertrude appeared in the doorway, her face more tense than usual. "Your son is here, and he's not alone." Bethany, of course. She would come too. His ex-wife never missed an opportunity to cause trouble. "Where's Lyra?" "In the back garden, drawing the roses. Should I call her?" "No," he replied quickly. "Leave her there for now. It's better she doesn't witness this." He went downstairs, just as Theodore and Bethany were entering the hall. His son, at 35, was practically his younger copy. The same green eyes, the same tall and elegant build. But where Richard cultivated a controlled expression, Theodore displayed a barely contained hostility. Bethany, on the other hand, maintained that fake smile he knew so well. At 58, she remained elegant and well-dressed, every detail of her appearance meticulously calculated to convey an image of sophistication and power. "What a surprise," Richard said, his voice carrying an irony he didn't try to hide. "I didn't know we were having a family reunion today." "Oh, darling," Bethany replied with false sweetness, "you know how these family things are. Sometimes we need to be a little spontaneous." "Where is she?" Theodore asked bluntly, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for evidence of a crime. "She has a name," Richard replied, feeling his irritation grow, "and she's not available at the moment." "Not available?" Bethany laughed, an artificial sound that echoed through the hall. How lovely, already playing the protective father. Theodore stepped forward, his posture tense. "That's exactly what we came to talk about. What's this story about you taking custody of some random child?" "Oh, she's not some random child," Richard replied, keeping his voice controlled with effort. "And I don't owe you an explanation for my decisions." "Oh, but you do," Bethany interjected, her smile disappearing. "When those decisions affect a family." "Family?" Richard interrupted her with a humorless laugh. "Now you remember your family. After years without a single visit, a single phone call." "Don't you dare throw that in my face," Theodore growled. "You know very well why I stayed away." "Do I really?" "Because the last time we talked, you were too busy accusing me of ruining your life to explain anything." The tension in the air was palpable. Gertrude, who was watching the scene discreetly, decided to intervene before the situation worsened. "I'll make some coffee," she announced, her firm voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere. "In the living room, perhaps, where you can talk civilly." The trio moved to the room, each carrying years of unresolved grudges and resentments. They sat in silence as Gertrude served coffee in fine porcelain cups, the same ones that Bethany had chosen when she was still the lady of the house. "So," Bethany began, holding her cup with studied elegance, "I hear the girl is the daughter of a comatose art teacher." "How convenient!" The tone she used made Richard's blood boil. "What exactly are you implying, Bethany?" "Oh, nothing," she shrugged, but her eyes gleamed with malice. "Just that it's curious how you, who never had time to raise your own son, suddenly develop a paternal interest in a complete stranger." "Lyra isn't a stranger," Richard replied, placing his cup on the table with more force than necessary. "She's the daughter of Catherine's last student." His sister's name fell like a bomb in the room. Theodore straightened in his chair, genuine surprise briefly replacing his hostile expression. "Aunt Catherine?" he asked, his voice softer. "The artist?" "Yes," Richard confirmed, noting the change in his son. "Lawrence, Lyra's father, was her last student before she died." "And that automatically makes you responsible for the girl," Bethany cut in, clearly annoyed by the change in the tone of the conversation. "No," Richard replied calmly. "What makes me responsible is the fact that she had no one else, and I owed that to my sister's memory." "Memory?" Bethany laughed, humorlessly. "The same sister you abandoned when she needed you most." The accusation hit Richard like a stab. His hands began to tremble slightly. "Don't talk about what you don't know, Bethany." "Oh, but I do. I know very well how you cut ties with Catherine when she chose to help poor people instead of joining your business. How you called her a foolish idealist. How—" "Enough!" Richard's shout startled everyone. Never, in all the years of their marriage, had Bethany seen him lose control like that. It was at that moment that a soft sound caught their attention. Lyra was standing in the doorway of the room, her wide eyes fixed on the scene before her. In her hands, she held a newly finished drawing. "Lyra!" Richard took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. "Shouldn't you be in the garden?" "I heard yelling," she replied softly, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar faces in the room. "Are you angry?" Before Richard could answer, Bethany stood up, assuming that falsely sweet tone she used when she wanted to manipulate someone. "Hello, dear. I'm Bethany, and this is Theodore. We're Uncle Richard's real family." The way she emphasized real family made Richard want to shout again, But it was Lyra's reaction that surprised everyone. The girl stepped forward, her chin raised in a display of courage that seemed too big for her small body. "Family doesn't yell at people they love," she said with a wisdom that made everyone in the room hold their breath. "Daddy always says that love is talking softly, even when you're angry." Theodore let out a strange sound, something between a laugh and a sob. Bethany turned red, all her pose of sophistication crumbling before the simple words of a child. "Well, that's absurd," she began, but Lyra wasn't finished. She walked to Richard and held out the drawing she was holding. It was a portrait of him, sitting in his study, a small smile on his face as he watched something out the window. "I made it for you," she said simply, "because you look sad when they talk about Aunt Catherine." Richard took the drawing with trembling hands. The way Lyra had captured his expression, that moment of contemplative loneliness that he thought no one noticed, was impressive. "How did you—" he began but couldn't finish. "You make the same face that Daddy made when he looked at Aunt Catherine's. Portraits," Lyra explained. "It's the face of someone who misses someone they loved very much." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Theodore had gotten up and approached to see the drawing, his expression a complex mixture of emotions. "She draws like Aunt Catherine," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. "Yes," Richard agreed softly, "she has the same gift." Bethany, realizing that she was losing control of the situation, decided to change tactics. "Well, this is all very touching," she said with false concern, "but it doesn't change the fact that a mansion isn't a place for a traumatized child. She needs professionals, a structured environment." "Like a foster home?" Richard cut in, his voice sharp. "Is that what you want, Bethany? To send a talented and sensitive child to a system that will crush her creativity? Just like you tried to do with Theodore when he wanted to study music?" It was Theodore's turn to turn pale. "How do I know?" "Because your mother may have managed to convince you to study business, son. But I saw your sheet music. Notebooks. I saw how you played the piano when you thought you weren't listening. The words hung in the air like unspoken accusations, long-buried truths finally coming to the surface. The silence that followed Richard's words was broken only by the soft sound of Lyra's pencil against the paper. The girl had sat down on the rug and started drawing, seemingly oblivious to the tension that filled the room. But her eyes occasionally looked up, carefully observing the expressions of the adults around her. Theodore remained motionless, his face a mask of contradictory emotions. His father's words had hit a sensitive spot, touching wounds that he thought were healed. "You never said anything," he finally murmured, his voice carrying a vulnerability he hadn't shown in a long time. "All those years. You knew." "Of course I knew," Richard replied, running a hand over his tired face. "You were my son. Still, and even if I wasn't the best father, I always paid attention." "No!" Bethany interjected sharply, rising from her armchair. "Don't try to manipulate the situation, Richard. You never cared about Theodore's dreams. I was the one who was there. I was the one who—" "You were the one who destroyed those dreams," Richard completed, his voice low but firm. "Just like you're trying to do now with Lyra." "How dare you!" Bethany took a step forward, her face contorted with anger. "All I did was protect my son from becoming like Aunt Catherine." Lyra's voice, small but clear, cut through the argument like a sharp knife. All the adults turned to look at her, surprised not only that she had spoken, but by the understanding implicit in her words. "What do you know about Catherine?" Bethany asked, trying to keep her tone controlled when speaking to the child. Lyra looked up from her drawing, facing Bethany with an unsettling seriousness. "Daddy told me about her. How she taught art to people who couldn't afford lessons. How she believed that everyone deserved a chance to create beautiful things." Her small hands smoothed the paper in front of her, where a new drawing was taking shape. A female figure with a gentle smile, surrounded by children with brushes and pencils. He kept pictures of her, Lyra continued. He said she was the best teacher he ever had, that she saw beauty where others only saw problems. Theodore approached slowly, kneeling to get a better look at the drawing Lyra was making. How do you know what she was like? Those paint stains on the apron, she always wore it like that. There's a portrait of her in the apartment. There was, Lyra corrected herself, her voice faltering slightly as she remembered the fire. Daddy painted it. It was on the living room wall near the piano. Piano? Theodore asked, suddenly interested. Your father has a piano? Had, again the correction, accompanied by a small tremor in her lips. It was old and some keys didn't work right, but Daddy played it every night before bed. He said the music helped the drawings dream. Richard watched his son swallow hard, clearly affected by the girl's words. He knew that expression. It was the same one Theodore had as a child, sitting at the piano on the rare occasions when he thought he was alone at home. You know, Lyra continued, now adding small details to her drawing, Daddy always said that Aunt Catherine said that art isn't just drawing or music. It's anything you do with love, even when other people don't understand. Bethany scoffed, but her posture had changed. Something in Lyra's presence, in the way she spoke of art and love so naturally, seemed to have destabilized her. What about your father? She asked, trying to regain control of the situation. Don't you think he'd be worried to see you here with people you don't even know? It was Richard's turn to intervene, but Lyra was faster. Daddy knows Uncle Richard, she said simply, surprising everyone. He used to work here. What? Richard leaned forward, confused. What are you talking about, honey? Lyra bit her lip, as if realizing that she had said something she shouldn't have. It's just that I once found an old photo in Daddy's album. He was wearing a chauffeur's uniform in front of a big car, and this house was in the background. The world seemed to spin for a moment. Richard tried to remember all the drivers who had worked for him, but there were too many over the years. When was this? He asked, his voice hoarse. Daddy said it was when he was starting to study art, Lyra replied, concentrating on her drawing. He said he needed the job to pay for classes, but he couldn't use his real name because no one would want a driver who was an artist. The revelation fell like a bomb in the room. Theodore had sat down on the floor next to Lyra, completely forgetting his earlier pose of hostility. So her father isn't just a former student of Catherine's, he said slowly. He worked here. He knew our family. This changes everything, Bethany declared, a calculating gleam in her eyes. If he lied about his identity to get the job... No, Lyra exclaimed, for the first time showing real distress. Daddy isn't a liar. He just wanted to study art. He wanted to learn how to make beautiful things. Her small hands were trembling now, slightly crumpling the edge of the paper. Richard recognized the signs. She was on the verge of another episode. It's okay, honey, he said softly, approaching her. No one is accusing your father of anything, but Bethany wasn't willing to let the matter die. On the contrary, I think this is exactly what we needed. I'm going to contact my lawyers. A person who lies about their identity clearly isn't fit to... Enough! The shout came from Theodore, surprising everyone, especially his mother. He had stood up and was now facing Bethany with an expression that mixed anger and disappointment. Don't you realize what you're doing? It's exactly the same as what you did to me. Always manipulating, always destroying dreams in the name of protection. Theodore, Bethany began, but he interrupted her. No, Mom. Enough manipulation. Enough trying to control other people's lives. Look at this girl. She has the same gift that Aunt Catherine had. The same one I could have developed if you hadn't. His voice failed, and he turned away, walking to the window. The silence that followed was broken by a soft sob. Lyra had curled up on the rug, hugging her drawing. "Folder, I want to see Daddy," she murmured, silent tears streaming down her face. "Please, I want to see Daddy." Richard didn't hesitate. "I'll take you right now," he said, reaching out his hand to her. Gertrude, the housekeeper, who had remained discreetly in the corner of the room, approached immediately. "I'll get her bag." "This is ridiculous," Bethany protested. "You can't just—" "You sure can," Theodore interrupted, still looking out the window. "And I'm going with them." Everyone in the room froze for a moment, processing his words. Theodore finally turned around, his face showing a determination that Richard hadn't seen since he was a child. "If what Lyra says is true, if her father really worked here, I need to understand this story. I need to understand why Aunt Catherine chose him as a student, and maybe—" He hesitated, looking at the grand piano that occupied a corner of the room, covered by a protective tarp for years. "Maybe it's time to face some ghosts." Bethany opened her mouth to protest again, but something in her son's expression made her stop. For the first time in years, Theodore seemed truly decided about something. "Fine," she said coldly, grabbing her purse. "Do whatever you want. But don't say I didn't warn you when this whole thing blows up in your faces." She left the room with firm steps, the front door slamming shut behind her. The sound made Lyra flinch again, but this time Theodore was the one who approached to comfort her. "Hey," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "How about you show me more drawings on the way to the hospital? I want to know more about how Aunt Catherine taught art." Lyra's face lit up slightly, despite the tears. "You really want to see?" "Of course," Theodore smiled, and for a moment Richard saw in him the boy who used to play the piano in secret. "Maybe you can teach me too. I've always been terrible at drawing." "It doesn't matter," Lyra replied, repeating the words she always said to Richard. "Daddy says the important thing isn't to be perfect. It's to try with your heart," Theodore completed, surprising himself. "Aunt Catherine used to say that too." The ride to the hospital was silent, but in a different way from the tension that had normally filled the car in recent days. Lyra was sitting between Richard and Theodore in the back seat, her drawing folder open on her lap, showing page by page her little art gallery. Theodore watched each drawing with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions about the techniques she used or about the stories behind each illustration. His face showed a softness that Richard hadn't seen in years, as if Lyra's presence had broken some invisible barrier he kept erected. "This one," Lyra explained, showing a particularly detailed drawing, "was the last one Daddy did before the fire. It's the view from our window." The drawing showed a simple cityscape, old buildings, a small square with trees, people walking. But there was something in the way the colors mixed, how the light seemed to dance between the buildings, that perfectly captured the atmosphere of late afternoon in the city. "He's very talented," Theodore commented, studying the details. "I can understand why Aunt Catherine chose him as a student." "She said he had special eyes," Lyra said, clearly repeating something she had heard many times. "That he saw the music. In the colors and the colors in the music." Theodore exchanged a quick glance with his father in the rearview mirror. "Synesthesia," he murmured. "Aunt Catherine had that too. That's why she always said she could hear the colors." The car stopped in the hospital parking lot, but no one made any mention of leaving immediately. There was something in the air, a kind of anticipation, as if everyone felt they were about to discover something important. "Before we go in," Richard said, turning to face Theodore, "I need you to understand something. Lawrence's condition is serious. He's been in a coma for weeks, and the doctors—" "He's going to wake up," Lyra interrupted with that unwavering certainty that only children possess. "He's just resting because he saved so many people from the fire." "So many people?" Theodore asked gently. "Were there other people in the building?" Lyra nodded, her fingers playing with the edge of a drawing. Mrs. Miller from the first floor, and her cats, and Mrs. Rodriguez's baby from the third. Daddy helped everyone out before going back to look for me. The information hit Richard like a punch. In all the weeks since he had found Lyra, she had never mentioned this detail. "Why didn't you tell me this before, honey?" Lyra shrugged, a surprisingly adult gesture. "Daddy always says we shouldn't brag about the good things we do, that real kindness is when no one finds out." Theodore let out a strange sound, something between a laugh and a sob. That's exactly what Aunt Catherine used to say. They finally entered the hospital, Lyra leading the way with the familiarity of someone who knows every corridor. The nurses waved as always, but their curious glances followed Theodore, noting his resemblance to Richard. In room 304, a surprise awaited them. The attending physician was there, examining the monitors with an intrigued expression. "Ah, good, you're here," he said upon seeing Richard. "I really needed to talk to you. We've been observing some interesting changes in the patient's brain patterns in the last few hours." Changes? Richard felt his heart accelerate. What kind of changes? Increased brain activity, response to stimuli. It's subtle, but significant, especially when someone talks to him or when there's music in the environment. Theodore, who had approached the bed where Lawrence was lying, froze. "Music?" "Yes," the doctor confirmed, consulting his notes. The night shift nurse noticed that the monitors showed more activity when the radio at the nursing station played certain songs, especially piano. Lyra, who had already taken her usual place next to her father's bed, took his bandaged hand, him carefully. "It's because Daddy loves piano," she explained naturally. "He always said that some songs have colors so beautiful they look like paintings." The doctor raised his eyebrows, interested. "Synesthesia," he murmured, echoing Theodore's earlier observation. That would explain a lot about his responses to stimuli. Theodore moved slowly to the other side of the bed, his eyes fixed on Lawrence's partially bandaged face. There was something in his expression that Richard couldn't decipher. "The nurses mentioned that you sing to him sometimes," he said to Lyra. "What songs do you sing?" "The ones he played on the piano," she replied. "But I don't remember them all right. There was one that was his favorite, about the moon and stars, but I only remember a little bit." "Claire de Lune," Theodore murmured almost to himself. "Debussy." Lyra's eyes widened. "Yes, that was it. How do you know?" "Because it was Aunt Catherine's favorite too," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "It was the first song she taught me to play." A dense silence fell over the room, broken only by the rhythmic beep of the monitors. The doctor watched the equipment with renewed interest. "Interesting," he commented. "There's been a slight alteration in the patterns when you mentioned the music." Theodore took a step forward, a sudden decision forming on his face. "Is there a piano in the hospital, in the chapel maybe?" The doctor nodded. "Yes, there's an upright piano in the chapel, but can I play it here in the room?" "Well," the doctor hesitated. "It's not exactly protocol, but considering the responses we've been observing, perhaps we can make an exception." An hour later, with the help of some hospital staff, an old upright piano was carefully installed in the room. It was nothing compared to the grand piano in the mansion, but Theodore looked at it as if it were a precious treasure. "It's been so long," he murmured, running his fingers lightly over the yellowed keys. "I don't even know if I still remember." "Of course you remember," Richard said softly. "Some things you never really forget." Theodore took a deep breath and began to play. The first notes of Claire de Lune filled the room, hesitant at first, but soon gaining confidence. It was as if each key pressed released years of repressed music. Lyra had approached the piano, her eyes shining with fascination. "That's it," she exclaimed. "It's exactly how Daddy played." The doctor, who had remained to observe, suddenly moved towards the monitors. "Look at this," he said urgently. "The brain activity has increased significantly." Theodore continued playing, his hands now moving more securely over the keys. Silent tears ran down his face, but he didn't stop. It was then that something extraordinary happened. One of Lawrence's fingers moved. It was an almost imperceptible movement, but everyone in the room saw it. "Daddy!" Lyra cried, running to the bed. "He moved! I saw it!" The doctor was already next to the patient, performing a quick series of tests. "Keep playing," he instructed Theodore. "We need to maintain the stimulus." The notes of Claire de Lune continued to float through the room as everyone watched, barely daring to breathe, waiting for another sign. Richard had approached the bed, his heart beating so hard it felt like it would explode. "Lawrence," he called softly, "if you can hear me, try to move your fingers again." For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, Lawrence's fingers moved. Again, this time more deliberately. "That's not just a reflex," the doctor declared, his voice trembling slightly with excitement. "He's consciously responding to the command. We need to do more tests, but this is significant progress." Lyra had carefully climbed onto the bed, her small body trembling with emotion. "I knew it," she whispered, kissing her father's bandaged hand. "I knew you were coming back." The last notes of Claire de Lune faded gently, but Theodore didn't move away from the piano. His hands remained on the keys, as if fearing that by moving away he would break some kind of spell. "I'm going to call the team to do a full evaluation," the doctor announced, heading quickly for the door. This may be the beginning of the awakening process. When they were alone in the room, Richard finally let his own tears fall. He watched his son at the piano, Lyra next to her father, the monitors showing signs of renewed life, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. But there was still much to be revealed, much to be understood. And something told him that the revelations that were to come could change everything they thought they knew about their lives. The days that followed completely transformed the routine of the hospital. Room 304 had become a kind of makeshift music room, with Theodore spending hours at the piano, relearning old melodies he thought he had forgotten. With each note he played, he seemed to recover not only the technique, but also parts of himself that he had buried long ago. Lyra remained a constant presence, dividing her time between drawing to the sound of the piano and talking to her father, who continued to show small but significant signs of improvement. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, although they warned that the recovery process would be long and uncertain. On a particularly quiet afternoon, while Theodore was playing a sonata by Mozart, Richard watched Lyra draw. She had created a series of illustrations inspired by the music, each somehow capturing the emotions that the melodies evoked. "How do you do that?" he asked, genuinely curious. "How can you see the music in the drawings?" Lyra looked up from her current work, thoughtful. "It's like Daddy taught me. Each song has a different color, a different feeling. This one," she pointed to the notes that Theodore was playing, "is light blue with little gold bits, like the sky when the sun is rising." The explanation, so simple and yet so profound, made Richard think of Catherine. His sister used to describe songs in the same way, as if she could literally see the notes in the air. "Uncle Theodore plays like Daddy," Lyra continued, adding more details to her drawing. "A little sad, but beautiful. Like the music was locked away for a long time and now it can breathe again." From the piano, Theodore missed a note, clearly affected by the girl's words. He recovered quickly, but his eyes were moist when he resumed playing. It was then that Gertrude entered the room, her normally controlled face showing clear concern. "Mr. Sterling," she called from the door, "we need to talk. It's better if you see for yourself." Richard followed her into the hallway where she handed him an envelope. "It arrived this morning. It's from social services." With a knot in his stomach, Richard opened the envelope. As he read the contents, his face lost color. "They can't do this," he murmured more to himself than to Gertrude. "What's wrong?" Theodore had stopped playing and joined them in the hallway. "Your mother," Richard replied, his voice laden with contained anger. "She contacted social services. They're questioning the suitability of the environment in the mansion for a traumatized child. They want to do a full assessment of the situation." "She can't," Theodore began, but stopped when he saw his father's expression. "She can, and you know how well connected your mother is. The request has already been approved. They want to take Lyra to a temporary shelter while they do the assessment." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of the monitors in Lawrence's room. Through the half-open door, they could see Lyra still absorbed in her drawing, oblivious to the storm that was brewing. "I won't allow it," Theodore declared finally, his voice firm. "I won't let her do that again. Not with Lyra." Richard looked at his son, surprised by the determination in his voice. "What do you mean, again?" Theodore ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that resembled his father so much that it was almost painful to see. "Remember when I was 16, that summer I spent at the music conservatory? The course you dropped out of halfway through?" "I didn't drop out," Theodore replied, bitterness evident in his voice. "Mom pulled me out of there, said I was turning into a useless dreamer, that I needed to focus on the real world. But before that were the best 2 months of my life." Richard felt something icy settle in his chest. "Why did you never tell me?" "Because she said you had agreed, that you both had decided it was better for me. I never—" Richard began, but was interrupted by a sound coming from the room. It was Lyra humming softly as she drew. The melody was Clair de Lune, the song that seemed to have become a link between all of them. "I can't let that happen," Richard said. "Finally, I can't let them take away from her the chance they took from you." "Then fight," Theodore replied simply. "And this time don't fight alone." Before they could continue the conversation, a commotion at the nursing station caught their attention. The doctor in charge of Lawrence was running down the hallway, followed by 2 nurses. "Mr. Sterling," he called, almost out of breath. "The latest tests. There's significant brain activity. We believe he may be close to waking up." The world seemed to freeze for a moment. Richard and Theodore exchanged a quick glance before running back to the room. Lyra was already standing next to the bed, holding her father's hand. The monitors showed patterns different from the usual, with more peaks and variations. "Daddy?" she called softly. "Are you coming back?" It was then that it happened. Slowly, as if emerging from the depths of a very dark ocean, Lawrence's eyes began to move under his eyelids. "Keep talking to him," the doctor instructed, checking vital signs. "He's responding to your voice." "Daddy," Lyra continued, her voice trembling slightly, "I brought a lot of new drawings for you to see, and Uncle Theodore is playing the piano, just like you used to. Remember the moon song? He knows how to play it, just like you." Lawrence's fingers moved, squeezing Lyra's hand. Slightly, his eyelids fluttered, struggling to open. "Come on, Lawrence," the doctor encouraged. "You can do it. Open your eyes." It was a slow, almost painful process to watch. But finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Lawrence's eyes opened. The first thing he saw was his daughter's new face, stained with tears but smiling like a little son. He tried to speak, but the tube in his throat prevented him. "Don't try to talk yet," the doctor instructed quickly. "We're going to remove the tube, but we need to do some tests first." Lawrence nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving Lyra's face. Then, slowly, his gaze scanned the room, registering the piano, Theodore standing next to it. And finally, when his eyes met Richard's, something changed in his expression. It wasn't fear or anger, as would be expected when seeing a former employer he had lied to. It was something more complex, more profound. "Mr. Sterling," the doctor called softly. "Perhaps it's best to wait outside while we do the necessary procedures." But before they could move, Lawrence raised his free hand, making a weak but clear gesture towards Richard. He wanted him to stay. "All right," the doctor agreed. But only for a moment. While the medical team worked to remove the breathing tube and do the necessary assessments, a silent tension grew in the room. There was something in Lawrence's gaze, a contained urgency, as if he desperately needed to communicate something. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the tube was removed and he could breathe on his own. His voice, when he finally managed to speak, was hoarse and weak after weeks of disuse. "Mr. Sterling," he whispered, each word clearly costing him an enormous effort, "we need to talk." "Shh, don't strain yourself," Richard tried to soothe, but Lawrence shook his head slightly. "No. Need to say, before it's too late." His voice failed, and he coughed, making the monitors beep in alarm. The doctor quickly intervened. "That's enough for today. He needs to rest. You can come back tomorrow." But as they were gently pushed out of the room, Richard couldn't stop. Thinking about Lawrence's expression, there was something there, some important truth that needed to be revealed, and something told him that this truth would change everything they thought they knew about their lives. The night that followed Lawrence's awakening was one of the longest Richard had ever lived. Back at the mansion, no one could really rest. Lyra, though exhausted by the day's events, resisted sleep, as if fearing that upon sleeping she would discover that it had all been nothing but a dream. "What if he sleeps again and doesn't wake up?" she asked for the third time, while Gertrude tried to convince her to go to bed. "What if—" "Your father is okay now," Theodore interjected softly, sitting on the edge of the bed next to her. "The doctors are taking care of him, and we'll go back to see him early tomorrow." "Promise?" "I promise. And you know what?" He smiled, picking up one of the drawings she had made that day. "I think we can prepare a surprise for him. How about I play the piano while you draw? We can do something special to show him when he's stronger." Lyra's eyes lit up at the idea, but soon after her expression changed to worry. "But what if the mean lady comes to get me before?" Theodore frowned, confused. "What mean lady?" "I heard you talking in the hallway," Lyra admitted in a low voice, "about someone wanting to take me to a shelter." Richard, who was watching the scene from the door, felt his heart clench. Of course, she had heard. Children always perceive more than adults imagine. "No one is going to take you anywhere," he declared, entering the room. "I promise." "But the lady in the fancy coat said—" "She would," Lyra insisted, referring clearly to Bethany. "She said she was going to make everything turn to dust, like the fire did." The revelation hit everyone like a punch. Bethany had spoken directly to Lyra. "When? When did she say that, honey?" Theodore asked, his voice trembling slightly with contained anger. "At the hospital," Lyra replied, pulling her blanket closer as if seeking protection. "She came into the room when you went to get coffee. She said that people like me shouldn't be in houses like this, that she was going to fix everything." Gertrude let out a muffled exclamation of indignation. Theodore had turned pale, his hands unconsciously gripping the drawing he was holding. "Why didn't you tell us before?" Richard asked gently, sitting down on the other side of the bed. Lyra shrugged, a gesture that seemed too big for her small body. "Daddy always says that some people are like bad painted. They seem beautiful from afar, but up close it's all a mess. He said we shouldn't let them make us feel small." The wisdom contained in those childlike words made everyone in the room hold their breath. It was the kind of observation Catherine used to make, turning difficult lessons into metaphors that anyone could understand. "Your father is a very wise man," Theodore said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Yes," Lyra agreed, a small smile appearing on her face. "And now he'll be able to tell all the stories again." Finally, overcome by the day's exhaustion, Lyra fell asleep. The adults retreated silently to Richard's study, where a serious conversation awaited them. "We need to do something," Theodore declared as soon as the door closed. "I can't believe, Mom, that she would be capable." "You more than anyone should know what your mother is capable of," Gertrude interrupted, her voice carrying an unusual acidity. "Or have you forgotten how she manipulated everything to keep you away from music?" Theodore slumped into an armchair, running his hands over his tired face. "No, I haven't forgotten. It's just that threatening a child, that's a new low, even for her." "She's desperate," Richard observed, pouring himself a drink. "And desperate. People do unthinkable things. But why?" Theodore questioned. "Why does she care so much about who lives here? She left this house years ago, built her own life." "It's not about the house," Gertrude interjected again. "It's about control. It always has been." A heavy silence fell over the study as everyone processed that truth. The sound of the antique clock on the wall seemed strangely loud, marking minutes that seemed to drag on. "There's one more thing," Richard said finally, "something I've been thinking about since Lawrence woke up. The way he looked at me. There was something there. Something he needs to tell us." "I noticed that, too," Theodore agreed. "It was as if he knew us, not just as a former employee, but..." He was interrupted by a sharp scream coming from upstairs. "Lyra!" Everyone ran to her room, finding her sitting up in bed, trembling violently. Another sleepwalking episode, but this seemed different from the previous ones. "The safe," she mumbled, her eyes open but not really seeing. "Daddy said the safe behind the painting, the letters." "What safe?" Theodore asked, but Richard had already frozen in place. The safe. The old safe that was hidden behind a painting in his father's study, now his study. He hadn't opened it in years, considering it just a repository of old, unimportant documents. "The letters from Aunt Catherine," Lyra continued, mumbling. "Daddy kept them, needed to keep them." Gertrude was already beside her, trying to calm her with soft words. Gradually, Lyra was coming to, blinking confusedly at the worried faces around her. "Were you dreaming about the fire again?" Theodore asked gently, but Lyra shook her head. "No, it was different. I was in a place with a lot of paintings, and Daddy was writing something. He looked younger and he was crying. He hid some letters in a secret place and said that one day he would tell everything." Richard and Theodore exchanged a meaningful look. "Stay with her," Richard asked Gertrude. "We need to check something." In the study, Richard removed the heavy oil painting that decorated the main wall, a seascape that his father had always admired. Behind it, partially hidden by the old wallpaper, was the safe. "Do you know the combination?" Theodore asked, watching his father turn the numeric dial with slightly trembling fingers. "It's Catherine's birthday," Richard replied. "Dad never changed it, even after she passed." The safe opened with a soft click, revealing stacks of documents yellowed with time. On top of them, a manila envelope, seemingly more recent than the other papers. Richard picked it up carefully, noticing handwriting he didn't recognize on the front. He opened it slowly, feeling that he was about to discover something that would change everything. Inside were several letters, all addressed to Catherine, all written by the same hand, and along with them, a note directed to him. "Mr. Sterling, if you're reading this, it means something has happened to me. These letters belong to your sister, Catherine. She asked me to keep them safe, to deliver them at the right moment. I believe that moment has finally arrived. There is much you need to know about the past, about your family, about me, but mostly about the real reason why your sister distanced herself. Forgive me for keeping secrets all these years. As she always said, some truths are like paintings. They need the right time and the right light to be truly seen." Lawrence Mendez. Richard felt his hands tremble as he picked up the first letter from the stack. The date on top made him catch. His breath, it was from just a week before Catherine's death. He began to read aloud, his voice failing slightly. "Dear Lawrence, if you are reading this letter, it means that I have not been able to have the conversation that I intended to have with my brother. Time is running out, I can feel it, and there is so much still to be said. But first, I need you to understand why I chose you to keep these secrets. You, more than any other student, understood that art is not just about creating beauty, it's about revealing truths, even when those truths are painful." Richard's hands trembled as he continued to read Catherine's letter, each word seeming to carry the weight of decades of unrevealed secrets. "There is something you need to know about the Sterling family, something that not even my own brother knows. Our fortune, the entire empire that our father built and that Richard now manages, began with a terrible choice. A choice that haunted our father until his last day. The Villa Nova Cultural Center, the same one where I now teach, where you and so many other talented young people found your voice through art, is built on the ruins of something much older and much more precious. It was a community center run by local artists that offered free classes for underprivileged children. Our father destroyed it, not just the building, but the dreams of hundreds of people who depended on that space. He used his influence to get the expropriation, claiming that the site would be transformed into a public school. But it was a lie. In its place, he built his first luxury hotel, the beginning of what would become the Sterling chain. I discovered this by chance years later when I found old documents in his office. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He only said that sacrifices were necessary to build a legacy. But I saw in his eyes the weight of that decision, the remorse he carried. That's why I started teaching art to children, underprivileged children. It was my way of trying to correct a mistake from the past, of giving back something that our family had taken from the community. Richard never understood why I wasted my time with it. He still doesn't know the truth about how our fortune began. But there's more, Lawrence. Something that makes all of this even more painful. Among the artists who lost their space in that demolition was your grandmother. Richard stopped reading, his voice failing. Theodore, who had sat down in the nearby armchair, was pale. "Continue," he asked in a whisper. "Please." Richard took a deep breath and returned to the letter. "Your grandmother was an incredible artist, Lawrence. She coordinated the painting classes at the community center. When the building was demolished, she lost not only her workspace, but all of her works that were stored there. Years of creation, memories, stories, all reduced to rubble. She never recovered from the blow. Art was her life, her way of communicating with the world. Without it, she was slowly withering away until she passed away a few months later. Your mother told me this story when you joined my class. She said that you had inherited your grandmother's gift, that unique ability to see music in the colors and colors in the music. That's why I chose you as my special student, Lawrence. Not just because of your talent, which is immense, but because I saw in it a chance for redemption, a way for the universe to correct a mistake through the generations. When you got the job as a chauffeur at the Sterling Mansion, using another name to avoid being recognized, I understood that fate was weaving something bigger than all of us. But now my time is running out, and there are decisions that need to be made. Richard needs to know the truth. He needs to understand the real weight of our choices, of our legacy. Maybe then he will finally understand why I chose the path I chose. Keep these letters, Lawrence. Keep them until the right moment. You will know when it's time to reveal them. As I always say in our classes, some truths are like paintings. They need the right light to be truly seen. The letter ended with Catherine's signature, a small drawing of a bird next to her name. Richard let the paper fall onto the table, feeling as if all the air had been sucked out of his lungs. So that's it. Theodore murmured, his voice thick with emotion. That's why he worked here. That's why he kept the letters. He knew, Richard agreed, running a hand over his tired face. He knew everything from the beginning, and yet he saved all those people from the fire, Theodore completed, even knowing that our family had destroyed his grandmother's life. A noise at the door made them turn. Gertrude was there, carrying a sleeping Lyra in her arms. She couldn't sleep, she explained in a low voice, kept asking to see the paintings. When she finally fell asleep, she was mumbling something about colors and music. Richard got up to take Lyra, gently settling her on the sofa in the study. In her sleep, she clutched her inseparable drawing folder to her chest. She's just like her grandmother, he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's face. She has the same gift. What now? Theodore asked, watching the scene. What do we do with all of this? Before Richard could answer, the phone rang. The strident sound seemed strangely loud in the silence of the study. Gertrude answered quickly so as not to wake Lyra. It's from the hospital, she said, extending the phone to Richard. Lawrence is asking to speak with you. Says it's urgent. With a racing heart, Richard took the phone. Lawrence's voice on the other end of the line was stronger than earlier, although still hoarse. Mr. Sterling, did you find the letters? Yes, Richard replied, feeling a lump in his throat. Lawrence, I didn't know. I know, Lawrence interrupted him gently. Catherine always said you didn't know, that if you did, you would have done differently. Why didn't you ever tell me all these years? Because it wasn't the time, Lawrence replied, and Richard could hear the weariness in his voice. Catherine said that some truths are like seeds. They need the right soil to grow. And now, seeing how you take care of Lyra, how you fought to protect her, I know that the soil is ready. There was a pause, filled only by the sound of Lawrence's breathing and the monitors in the background. There are more letters, he continued, more truths that need to be revealed. But first I need you to promise something. Anything, Richard replied without hesitation. Promise that you will protect Lyra, not just from your ex-wife or the system, but from herself. She has the same gift that my grandmother had, that I have. She sees the world in a different, special way. Don't let anyone destroy that in her. I promise, Richard said, his voice firm despite the tears that were beginning to form. I promise by Catherine. There was another moment of silence. Then Lawrence spoke again, his voice now carrying a different urgency. There's something happening here at the hospital. I overheard the nurses talking. Someone is trying to transfer me to another unit, far from the city. I think your ex-wife is involved. Richard felt his blood run cold. Of course, Bethany wouldn't give up easily. If she could move Lawrence away, it would be easier to question Lyra's custody. I won't allow it, he declared firmly. I'm going to take care of this right now. Wait, Lawrence interrupted him. Before that, I need to tell you one more thing. About the day of the fire, there's something you need to know. But before he could continue, Richard heard raised voices in the background, the sound of people entering the room. I have to hang up, Lawrence said quickly. They're here. The letters. Look in the letters. The truth about the fire. The line went dead. Richard stood there for a moment, the phone still in his hand, feeling that he was about to lose something precious once again. He couldn't allow it. Not again. Theodore, he called, his voice assuming that commanding tone he used to use in important negotiations. Stay here with Lyra. Gertrude, prepare the car. We're going to the hospital now. I'm going with you, Theodore declared, rising. No, I need you to stay. If Bethany tries something here, you can count on me. Theodore nodded, understanding. I won't let them take Lyra. As he headed quickly for the door, Richard paused for a moment to look at the girl asleep on the sofa. In her sleep, She smiled slightly, her fingers still holding the drawing folder, as if it were her most precious possession. "Some truths are like paintings," he murmured to himself, repeating Catherine's words. "They need the right light to be seen." And now, finally, he was ready to see the truth in all its light. The drive to the hospital never seemed so long. Even at that late hour, with the streets practically empty, every traffic light, every curve seemed to conspire to delay Richard. Beside him in the back seat, Gertrude held tightly to the envelope with Catherine's letters, which he had insisted on bringing. "There's something here," she said, examining the papers in the dim light of the car. "Something about the fire, but the letter is in a different order from the others." "Read it," Richard asked, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Gertrude adjusted her reading glasses and began, "My dearest Lawrence, if you are reading this specific letter, it means that something has gone wrong, very wrong. I've been observing strange movements, people asking questions about the old community center, about the demolition documents. Someone is investigating the past, and I fear that this may bring dangerous consequences. Yesterday, I received an unexpected visit from Bethany, Richard's wife. She found some of the old documents, those that prove the irregularity in the demolition of the center. She's using this as a bargaining chip in the divorce process, but there's something more sinister in her intentions. She mentioned you, Lawrence. She knows that you worked at the mansion using another name. She knows about your connection to the old community center, and I fear that she may use this in some way to harm you or your family. That's why I'm writing this letter separately. If something happens, if in any way you or your family are threatened, look for my brother. Show him the other letters first. Make him understand gradually. He has a good heart. He's just gotten lost along the path our father laid out." "My God," Richard murmured, his mind racing to connect the dots. Bethany knew. She always knew. "There's more," Gertrude continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I've kept copies of all the important documents in a safe place. Bethany doesn't know about this. If something happens to me before I can resolve this situation, the documents are hidden." A sharp sound from Richard's cell phone interrupted the reading. It was Theodore. "Dad," his voice sounded urgent. "I just got a call from the hospital. They're trying to transfer Lawrence right now. Mom's there with some kind of court order." "How did she get that so fast?" Richard asked, more to himself than to his son. "She probably had everything prepared," Theodore replied, the anger evident in his voice. "She was just waiting for Lawrence to wake up to act. We're almost there. How's Lyra?" "Still sleeping, but Dad, there's one more thing. I found more letters hidden in her drawing folder. They're different from the others. They're from around the time of the fire." Richard felt his heart skip a beat. "What do they say?" It's better if you read them yourself when you get back. But Dad, the fire wasn't an accident. The car almost skidded when Richard slammed on the brakes. Luckily, they were arriving at the hospital parking lot. "Stay with Lyra," he instructed, quickly. "Don't let anyone into the mansion. And Theodore, thanks for being by my side in this." He hung up before his son could reply. Gertrude was already getting out of the car, surprisingly agile for her age. "What are you going to do?" she asked as they ran towards the hospital entrance. "Prevent Bethany from making another terrible mistake," Richard replied, his voice carrying a determination he hadn't felt in years. The hospital was strangely busy for that time of night. As soon as they got off the elevator on Lawrence's floor, they understood why. Bethany was in the middle of the hallway, surrounded by men in suits who looked like lawyers. She was holding papers in her hands and gesturing animatedly as she spoke to the doctor in charge. "It's a completely legal transfer," she was saying. "I have the court order here. The patient needs specialized care that only the Santa Clara Institute can offer." "The Santa Clara Institute is 5 hours from here," the doctor protested. Patient has just come out of a deep coma. A transfer now could... He's not going anywhere. Richard's voice cut through the discussion like a knife. Bethany turned around, her eyes narrowing as she saw him. For a moment, her mask of sophistication wavered, revealing something close to panic. "You can't stop me," she said, but her voice betrayed her insecurity. "I have a court order." "Based on what exactly?" Richard asked, approaching slowly. "On your concern for the well-being of a stranger, or on the fear of what he might reveal?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Bethany replied quickly, too quickly. "No." Richard pulled one of the letters from the envelope Gertrude was holding. "Then maybe this will refresh your memory. A letter from Catherine, mentioning your unexpected visit, talking about old documents you found, documents about the center." Bethany's face lost all color. The lawyers beside her exchanged confused glances. "That was a long time ago," she tried to argue. "It has nothing to do with..." "It has everything to do with it," Richard interrupted her. "Because you never gave up those documents, did you? You kept them as a trump card, waiting for the right moment to use them. And when you found out that Lawrence had woken up..." "He's a threat!" Bethany burst out suddenly, all her pose of control crumbling. "He can destroy everything, years of work, our social standing, our..." Richard laughed humorlessly. "There's no more our social standing, Bethany. You lost that right the moment you started manipulating our son to destroy his dreams, like my father destroyed that center." The lawyers now seemed decidedly uncomfortable. One of them cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Mrs. Sterling, if there is any conflict of interest that we weren't informed of..." "There's no conflict at all," Bethany practically screamed. "Just do your job. Remove the patient." "He's not removing anyone." A new voice entered the discussion. Everyone turned to see Lawrence standing in the doorway of his room, supported by a nurse. He was pale and visibly weak, but his eyes gleamed with a fierce determination. "Mr. Mendes," the doctor advanced worriedly, "you shouldn't be standing." "I needed to see it with my own eyes," Lawrence replied, his gaze fixed on Bethany. "I needed to be sure it was you. Even after all these years, even after what you did." What are you talking about?" Richard asked, feeling that they were about to discover something crucial. "About the fire," Lawrence replied simply. "About the fire that your ex-wife had set at my apartment." The hallway plunged into a deadly silence. The lawyers recoiled, as if fearing to be contaminated by the accusation. The doctor and the nurse exchanged shocked glances. "That's absurd!" Bethany tried to protest, but her voice failed. "Is that true?" Richard asked, approaching. You would be capable." "She would," Gertrude interjected, holding out another letter. "It's all here. Catherine found out, tried to warn him. That's why Bethany needed those old documents, to have power over all of us, to ensure that no one would talk." "You don't understand." Bethany turned to Richard, her eyes now gleaming with manic desperation. "I did it for us, for our family. He was going to reveal everything. He was going to destroy everything we built. So you tried to destroy him first." Richard completed, feeling suddenly exhausted, not caring that an innocent child could die in the process. "Lyra wasn't part of the plan," Bethany protested, then realized her mistake. The lawyers immediately began to gather their papers, murmuring apologies and quickly moving away. One of them was already on the phone, presumably contacting their office to disassociate themselves from the case. "It's all recorded," the nurse announced, holding up her cell phone. "I started recording as soon as I heard the commotion in the hallway." Bethany staggered, needing to lean against the wall. All her pose of sophistication had disappeared, revealing the true face of a woman who had built her life on lies and manipulation. "Security is on its way," the doctor informed them, "and we've already called the police." Richard approached Lawrence, who looked about to faint from exhaustion. "Forgive me," he said softly, "for everything. For what my father did to your family? For what Bethany did to you and Lyra? No, Lawrence interrupted him, a small smile appearing on his tired face. Catherine was right about you. You have a good heart. You just needed to find your way. Back to it? As they watched Bethany being led away by the hospital security guards, Richard couldn't help but think about how his sister's words continued to echo through the years, through the generations. How some truths really needed the right moment to be revealed. But there was still one last truth to be confronted, one that would forever change not only his life, but the future of everyone involved in that story of pain and redemption. The return to the mansion that early morning was marked by a silence charged with contained emotions. Lawrence had insisted on accompanying them, despite the doctor's protests. "I need to see my daughter," was all he said, and something in his voice allowed no further argument. Gertrude followed in the front seat with the driver, still holding the envelope with the letters as if it were a precious treasure. In the back seat, Richard supported Lawrence, who was struggling to keep his eyes open, clearly exhausted by the effort of standing after so long in a coma. "There's something I need to tell you," Lawrence said softly, his voice almost a whisper. Something that not even Catherine knew. Richard felt his heart race. After all the revelations of that night, what more could there be? "Remember the day I was fired from the mansion?" Lawrence continued, his eyes focused on some distant point through the car window. "The day your father found out that I was using a fake name?" "Vaguely," Richard replied, trying to rummage through old memories. "I was traveling at the time. I only found out when I got back." "You weren't," Lawrence corrected him gently. "You were in your father's office. You saw me being kicked out, but you didn't interfere. On that day, I thought you were just like him. Cold, calculating, capable of destroying lives without batting an eye." Richard felt as if something icy settled in his chest. The memory was beginning to return, hazy but undeniable. I remember now. You tried to explain something, but you turned your back," Lawrence completed without accusation, in his voice. "And you know what's most ironic? On that same day I had decided to tell you everything about my grandmother, about the community center, about the classes with Catherine. I had prepared all the documents, all the evidence." He paused, breathing with difficulty. Richard offered him water from a bottle that Gertrude had provided. "What happened to the documents?" he asked after Lawrence drank a few sips. "I gave them to your sister to keep. She promised that one day, when the moment was right, she would give everything to you. But then she fell ill so suddenly." "And Bethany found the documents first," Richard concluded, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. "Exactly. She started looking for me, making veiled threats. She said that if I tried to tell anything, she would use the documents to destroy the reputation of the Sterling family, including Catherine. That's why you distanced yourself? To protect Catherine?" Lawrence nodded slightly. "She was already very sick. I couldn't allow her last days to be tainted by scandals and accusations. So I distanced myself, moved to another city, tried to rebuild my life away from all of this." "But Bethany didn't give up," Richard guessed. "No, she kept that information as a weapon, waiting for the right moment to use it. When she found out that I had returned to the city, that I was teaching at the same community center that Catherine helped rebuild, I think something in her simply broke." The car made a smooth turn, entering the driveway that led to the mansion. The garden lights created dancing shadows through the trees, giving an almost surreal air to the scene. "The fire," Richard murmured. "She was the one who planned everything." "I found out by chance," Lawrence continued, his voice now firmer. "I overheard a conversation a few days before. She had hired someone to give a scare, as she said. It was supposed to be just a small fire in the hallway, something to scare me enough to go away for good. But it went wrong. Completely wrong. The fire spread much faster than they planned. Soon the whole building was on fire. I was on the ground floor helping Mrs. Miller with her cats when it started. I managed to get her and the animals out. Then I went back to help other residents. Lawrence closed his eyes for a moment, reliving that terrible night. When I got to our floor, Lyra was in the room, scared by the smoke. I tried to grab as much as I could, some drawings, important documents, the folder with Catherine's letters that I always kept, but the fire was everywhere. How did you get out? Honestly, I don't remember exactly. I know I covered Lyra with a wet blanket, grabbed the drawing folder because I knew how much it meant to her, and ran. The last thing I remember is the intense heat, the suffocating smoke, and then I only woke up today in that hospital room. The car stopped in front of the mansion. Through the illuminated windows, they could see movement inside the house. Theodore must be worried, Richard commented, helping Lawrence out of the car. Is Lyra still sleeping? As if to answer his question, the front door opened and a small figure in pajamas ran out. Daddy! Lyra's cry cut through the night like a ray of light. Lawrence staggered forward, falling to his knees to receive his daughter in his arms. The impact almost knocked him over, but he didn't seem to care, hugging her with all the strength he could muster. My little artist, he murmured through tears, my most precious treasure. Everyone watched the scene with teary eyes. Richard, Theodore, who had followed Lyra to the door, Gertrude, who discreetly wiped away a tear. I knew you were coming back, Lyra was saying, her little face buried in her father's shoulder. I knew you weren't going to leave me alone. Never, Lawrence promised, kissing the top of her head. I'm never going to leave you alone again. It was then that Lyra pulled back a little, her eyes shining with that ancient wisdom she sometimes displayed. I wasn't alone, Daddy, she said seriously. Uncle Richard and Uncle Theodore took care of me, and Miss Gertrude too. They're our family now. Lawrence raised his eyes, meeting Richard's gaze. There was so much to be said, so much to be forgiven, so much to be rebuilt. Yes, he agreed softly. I think they are. Theodore approached, helping Lawrence to stand up. Let's go inside. There's a piano in there that's dying to be played. And there's fresh coffee in the kitchen, Gertrude added, with those cookies that Miss Lyra helped make. As the group headed inside, Richard remained in the garden for a moment, looking at the sky that was beginning to lighten. Somewhere, he was sure Catherine was smiling. You were right, sis, he murmured to the stars that were beginning to fade. Some truths really need the right moment to be seen, and some families need to be destroyed to be truly rebuilt. From inside the house, the first chords of Clair de Lune began to float through the night. Theodore was at the piano, with Lyra beside him, watching his fingers on the keys intently. But there was still one last truth to be revealed. A final secret kept in those letters, something that would forever change the meaning of family for all of them. The early morning hours slowly passed in the Sterling mansion, but no one thought of sleeping. In the living room, Lawrence rested in a comfortable armchair, with Lyra asleep in his lap. His fingers absently stroked his daughter's hair while his eyes followed Theodore's movements at the piano. Gertrude had prepared a tray with coffee, tea, and cookies, which everyone shared in a comfortable silence. It was as if, after all the revelations of the night, they needed this moment of peace to process everything that had happened. It was Richard who finally broke the silence, holding the last letter from the envelope that they hadn't read yet. There's one more, he said softly. The date. It's from the day Catherine passed. Everyone in the room held their breath. Theodore stopped playing, his hands hovering over the piano keys. Lawrence adjusted Lyra more comfortably in his arms, as if seeking strength in contact with his daughter. Read it, he asked simply. Richard opened the envelope carefully, noting that the paper was yellower than the others, the folds more marked, as if it had been read and reread many times. "My dearest brother," he began to read, his voice trembling slightly. "If you are reading this letter, it means that Lawrence has finally found the courage to reveal the whole truth. And if you've gotten this far, it means that your heart is ready for the last revelation." He paused, taking a breath. Something in the tone of the letter, in the way Catherine addressed him directly, made his heart clench. "There's something I've never told anyone, not even Lawrence. Something that happened many years ago when we were young and the weight of our family's expectations hadn't yet separated us. Remember that summer when I went to study art in Paris? It wasn't just art that I studied there. I met someone, I fell in love. I lived a story that seemed to come out of one of the novels Mom loved to read. He was a musician. He played the piano in small cafes to pay for his studies. He had the same gift as you, bro, that ability to make the notes dance, to transform melodies into colors. But unlike you, he didn't have a rich family to stifle his dreams. When I returned to the States, I brought with me more than memories. I was pregnant." Richard stopped reading abruptly, his eyes widening as he met Lawrence's across the room. "Continue," Lawrence asked softly. "Please." With trembling hands, Richard returned to the letter. "Dad was furious, of course. He threatened to disinherit me, sent me to a nursing home in the countryside. It was there that I gave birth to a beautiful boy with the same eyes as his father, the same sensitivity to music and colors. They didn't allow me to keep him. They said he would be adopted by a good family, that he would have a better life away from the scandal that his existence represented for the Sterlings. I spent years looking for him, using every resource I had. When I finally found him, he was already a young art teacher, raising his own daughter alone. My son, your nephew, Lyra's father." The silence that fell over the room was almost palpable. Theodore had risen from the piano, his shaky legs carrying him to a nearby armchair. Gertrude covered her mouth with her hands, silent tears streaming down her face. You knew?" Richard asked Lawrence, his voice almost a whisper. Lawrence shook his head negatively. "Not until today. Catherine never told me. But now everything makes sense. Why she chose me as her special student, why she dedicated herself so much to teaching me, why you have the same gift." Theodore completed, his voice thick with emotion. "The synesthesia, the ability to see colors in the music." "Keep reading," Lawrence asked. "Please, I need to know the rest." Richard took a deep breath and returned to the letter. "I didn't have the courage to tell him. What right did I have after so many years to enter his life and possibly destroy it with this revelation? He had already suffered so much with his adoptive family. He had already built his own story. So I did what I could from afar. I made sure he had the best opportunities to develop his talent. When I found out he was looking for a job, I subtly suggested the Sterling mansion. I wanted him to meet our family, even if he didn't know the real reason. But now, bro, with the disease progressing so quickly, I feel that I need to leave this. Truth recorded. Not to cause more pain or stir up old wounds, but because I believe that fate has its own plans. Lyra, my little granddaughter who doesn't even know I'm her. Grandmother has the same gift that I saw in you when we were children. The same ability to transform emotions into art, to see beauty where others only see gray. Take care of them, bro. Don't make the same mistakes that our family made. Don't let fear and pride destroy another generation of Sterlings. And Lawrence, my beloved son, if you ever read this letter, know that every moment I spent with you as your teacher was a treasure that I'll cherish beyond this life. Your talent, your sensitivity, your ability to love and create beauty. All of this is the greatest proof that some choices, even the most painful ones, can generate light. With all my love, even beyond time, Catherine. The letter ended, but no one moved for several minutes. The silence was broken only by Lyra's soft breathing, still asleep in her father's lap. No, in her cousin's lap. So we really are family. Theodore was the first to speak, his voice thick with emotion. Not just by choice, but by blood. We always were, Lawrence replied softly, looking at his daughter. Even without knowing it. Maybe that's why Lyra connected so quickly with you. Maybe that's why she sees music in colors, Richard completed, remembering the drawings she made while Theodore played the piano. Like you. Like Catherine. Like you too, Uncle, Lawrence said, the word uncle coming out naturally, as if it had always been there waiting to be said. Catherine told me about how you played the piano as a child, how you managed to turn each melody into a complete story. Richard stood up, walking to the piano. His fingers touched the keys lightly without producing sound. I stopped playing when Dad said that music wasn't a profession for a sterling, he murmured. I never allowed that part of me. It's never too late, Theodore said, joining his father at the piano. To start over, to learn, to create beauty. As if responding to those words, Lyra stirred in Lawrence's lap, her eyes opening slowly. The music stopped, she murmured sleepily. Why did the music stop? It didn't stop, honey, Lawrence smiled, kissing her forehead. It's just waiting to start again, with all the colors it deserves. 6 months had passed since the night of the revelations. The Sterling mansion, once a cold and austere place, had completely transformed. The sound of the piano now echoed frequently through the halls, sometimes played by Theodore, sometimes by Lawrence, and occasionally, in hesitant but determined attempts, by Richard, who was slowly rediscovering his passion for music. The walls, once decorated with severe paintings and formal portraits, now displayed a colorful gallery of Lyra's drawings, mixed with works by Lawrence and some old canvases by Catherine that had been discovered in the attic. It was as if the house had finally found its true voice, its true soul. On that particular Sunday morning, the whole family was gathered in the garden. Gertrude had prepared a special breakfast to celebrate an important occasion, the inauguration of the new Selina Sterling Cultural Center. I still can't believe we managed to finish everything on time, Theodore commented, watching Lyra, who was drawing sitting on the grass, trying to capture in her paper the colors of the sunrise. Your father can be very persuasive when he wants to be, Lawrence replied with a smile, adjusting the easel where he was working on his latest work, a portrait of the family gathered at the piano, each brushstroke capturing not only the people, but the music they made together. Richard, who was reading the newspaper in a nearby chair, looked up. It was easier than I expected, actually. After Bethany's story came to light, a lot of people wanted to help clear the Sterling family name. The mention of Bethany brought a brief moment of tension. After her arrest for crimes related to the fire, she had tried to negotiate, using the old documents about the community center as a bargaining chip. But Richard surprised her, making the whole story public. Not only the destruction of the old center, but also how his family had learned from their mistakes and was determined to do things right this time. Uncle Richard, Lyra called, holding up her drawing. Look, I managed to capture the exact color of the music that Uncle Theodore was playing yesterday. Everyone approached to see. The drawing showed the main hall of the new cultural center, but not as it really was, but as it would be at the inauguration later. Waves of color emanated from the piano in the center, enveloping figures that danced and smiled. It was surprisingly accurate, considering that Lyra still hadn't seen the space finished. That's exactly it, Theodore murmured, amazed. The blue curtains, the floor in shades of gold, even the place where each person will stand. It's her gift, Lawrence said softly. The same one that Catherine had. She doesn't just see what's there, but what can be, what will be. How are you feeling? Richard asked Lawrence. About teaching there? About continuing her work? Lawrence was silent for a moment, watching his daughter, who was now adding more details to the drawing, her tongue peeking out from the corner of her mouth in concentration, exactly as Catherine did when she painted. "It's as if it was always destined to be this way," he replied finally, "as if every step, every choice, even the difficult moments, were guiding us to this moment." "She would be proud," Gertrude commented, approaching with a tray of fresh coffee. "Catherine always said that art wasn't about creating beautiful things, it was about creating true things. And about family," Theodore added, sitting down at the grand piano they had installed in the garden, especially for occasions like that. "About finding harmony even after the chaos." His fingers began to dance over the keys, playing Clair de Lune, the music that had become a kind of unofficial anthem of the family. Lyra immediately picked up a new paper, her colored pencils moving to the rhythm of the melody. "Look," she exclaimed after a few minutes, "the music is different today. It has more colors." Everyone gathered around her again. The new drawing showed the same scene of the cultural center, but now with an additional figure, a woman with a gentle smile and bright eyes, sitting next to the piano, her hands raised as if conducting the colors that flowed from the music. "That's," Richard began, his voice failing with emotion. "Grandma Catherine," Lyra completed naturally, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "She's always there when we play. Can't you see her?" Lawrence hugged his daughter, hiding the tears that were beginning to form. "Yes, we see her. Honey, now we see." "It's time," Gertrude announced, consulting her watch. "We need to get ready for the inauguration." As everyone moved to go inside, Richard remained in the garden for a moment, looking at Lyra's drawing. The figure of Catherine seemed to smile directly at him, her eyes carrying that gentle wisdom that she always had in life. "You were right, sis," he murmured to the portrait, "about everything. About art, about family, about love, especially about how some truths need the right moment to be seen." Later, during the inauguration ceremony of the Selina Sterling Cultural Center, no one was surprised when Lyra took to the stage unannounced, interrupting the formal speeches to make her own announcement. "This place," she said with that unique seriousness she sometimes displayed, "isn't just a place for art. It's a place for families, for people who need to find their colors, their music, their truth." Then she turned to the piano, where Theodore was sitting, and made an imperious gesture. "Play it, Uncle. That song that has all the colors." And as the notes of Clair de Lune filled the hall, Richard watched the people around him. His nephew Lawrence, who smiled with pride at his daughter, his son Theodore at the piano, finally at peace with his gift, Gertrude, who discreetly wiped away a tear, and Lyra, who already had pencils and paper in her hands, ready to capture another moment in colors. It was a scene he had never imagined possible a few months ago. A family rebuilt not only by blood or documents, but by something deeper, by art, by music, by the ability to see beauty even after pain. On the stage, a large portrait of Catherine watched everything with her enigmatic smile. Beside it, a golden plaque shone with the words she so loved to repeat. "True art isn't about creating something perfect, but about transforming pain into beauty, fear into courage, and the past into lessons for the future. Because in the end, we are all just different." Colors in the same great painting called Family. And at that moment, as the music flowed and the colors danced in Lyra's drawings, everyone could see, really see, what Catherine had always known, that some families need to be broken to be truly rebuilt, and that love, like art, doesn't need to be perfect to be true. It just needed to be real and colorful and full of music like life should be.